Good morning and welcome to the Point. The legislature is on break for hunting season and Thanksgiving. The House and Senate will return for 9 days to finish up the year beginning December 3rd. There is still plenty to get done. Recently, we sat down with the leader of the House Democrats to talk about what's been accomplished and what lies ahead. Representative, we've talked over the course of the time, but it's been about 10 months since you and I sat down like this. And first of all, thank you for allowing us to come here and do this. It's been an interesting time in Lansing with divided government. So I want to go back to what we talked about then. I mean, you talked about some of your priorities and some of the things you wanted to happen, but a whole lot of this has come down to a conversation about the budget.
Yes.
And the budget that was ultimately passed, sent to the governor. The governor made her revisions to it. And now there's still an effort on the part of some that would like to change some of that, try to get a negotiated budget. How did that all come about?
It was frustrating, and it's still frustrating, but we actually did, in divided government, work on some really great policy packages. But unfortunately, I think with the whole budget process, that is, it's being overshadowed. With the budget, what happened was it was passed just with one party's input for the most part. And so when it arrived on the governor's desk very late, just a few days before the end of the fiscal year, she had to use the tools that she did to try to get everyone back to the table and really have a bipartisan budget. That's what we talked about doing from the very beginning of the session, is working on things together, but that budget didn't reflect it. So now we're kind of in the back and forth, and hopefully, we'll get back to that spot where we are working together and restoring some of these cuts that were made and doing right by the people of Michigan.
Well, and some of those cuts obviously didn't reflect necessarily what I think the governor's priorities were, but it was more trying to readjust the budget and going to the board, to the admin board, to try to get some of that worked around. So because of the governor's understanding, I mean, one of the things that we talked about in the run-up to the election and after the election, it's the first time in 16 years that we've had a governor that has the legislative experience. So she obviously knew what the tools were at her disposal. And in using those, she tried to rearrange that budget. And at the same time, probably created a bit more of a chasm that had already begun, because the conversation between the legislature and the governor broke off sometime in the summer. I'm not exactly sure when. I think I was actually talking to her that day, because she said, Rick, these things can fall apart at any time. And my assumption was they had just fallen apart. Yeah. But given all of that, and given that you are in the room, you're one of those 5 people that sit down for those quadrant meetings, how much dialogue is still going on? Are people still talking?
We are. We're still meeting. To be perfectly honest, we talk about a lot of different policy issues as well in those, but they're very cordial meetings. We do touch on a lot of different topics, and the fact that even when you hit a few bumps in the road, you're still getting together every couple of weeks and talking, it really says a lot about, the underlying willingness to work together. Now, we still got to work on that budget and get it done.
Well, I want to go back to the early part of the session when you and your colleagues did something that I had deemed impossible, and that was auto NoFault reform. For the entire time that I've been covering politics in Michigan, people have been talking about auto NoFault reform. And I had come to the point of view, cynical though it may have been, that they can talk all they want, but they don't have 56 votes. They're never going to put that together. That happened. And when that happened, and I know some of your members were not very happy about it,
right.
But when that happened, it suggested to me that this divided government thing might be on a smoother course than I thought. How did that change from the time that happened to the budget conversation?
Well, right. When we signed, we were all together on Mackinac Island to say that we were coming together to do these reforms and to set the stage going into the budget. And I clearly remember on Mackinac, we all got up there and said a few words. And I know in my remarks in particular was this is a start to start working together on roads, on the budget. And that was the spirit going into it. And then there was never a plan from the Republicans on the roads, and that's where a lot of it started to happen, and where we started to face obstacles. We have a huge problem with infrastructure here in this state, and not being willing to come to the table with other solutions so that we can have that dialogue and come up with, another bipartisan solution. It just didn't happen, and then next thing we know, the summer is gone and we haven't done it. And so, in my opinion, the governor did the most responsible thing and said, all right, we're going to put the roads discussion off to the side for now. We're going to get the budget done. We're going to make sure that we're not shutting down government. And then the Republicans ended up doing a budget that reflected some work on the roads without having that input from the governor, and that's where things went wrong. And so again, being presented a one-sided budget in the 11th hour, the governor, in her experience too, knowing those tools, did the transfers as well as the line item vetoes, and that was to get us all back in the room talking about this and coming up with budget items that we could all agree on, and setting the stage then, once the budget was done, to have the long-term roads discussion.
I want to go back to that scene on Mackinac Island, because it wasn't just about signing the bill. This is for the Detroit Regional Chamber Policy Conference that they do every year, and many legislators go up there, and it's become a statewide opportunity for people to have conversations about big issues. But I watched legislators up there, and I watched the governor, and I watched the interaction, and there was real conversation that was happening. I mean, there were people who were genuinely happy to be talking to each other. I mean, it wasn't pretense, because they weren't doing it for us. They were having these conversations. And you described these quadrant meetings as still being cordial. I said in a story I did after that meeting on Mackinac Island that this might be the best I had ever seen divided government working in the state of Michigan, because everybody seemed to truly have some, I don't want to use the word respect, because I hope we all respect each other, but I have some real connection with each other. So I was a little bit surprised when the budget, I knew the road thing was going to be pretty tough, but I was a little surprised when the budget went as south as it did. But what I'm hearing from you is that relationship still exists, even if you can't come to, I hate to use the word immediate too, but if you can't come to quick results.
Yeah. Well, during her State of the State address, the governor actually did say, and I think she closed with some of her remarks, that we have to see the humanity in each other. And you have to get to know each other as people first. And I think that is what we've done. We've spent the time just getting to know each other better on a personal level. Going into this, I did not know Senator Shirkey very well. I had worked with Senator Ananick. I'd worked, of course, with Speaker Chatfield, too. But just getting to know each other and how to communicate and how to talk through subjects was really important. And that's why, even though, again, you run into some bumps with the budget, with the long-term roads funding, the fact that you know each other as people really does help keep that dialogue going.
Yeah, it was interesting because the governor bothered to speak to each of you as leaders and talk a little bit about, I gather that your husband likes to cook, and and that Senator Shirkey likes to go home to be back in Jackson. When you have those meetings, and it's tough for somebody who's never been in this position, and I've never been in this position. So if you're all sitting around a table and we have this idea, and I think this happened this past week. I'm not going to ask you to confirm or deny it, but I think this happened last week. I think that there were, of the party, there are 5 of you. You meet for the quadrant meeting, which are the leaders and then the governor. I think that there were 4 people who may have had a similar thought about what could happen in order to make the budget work. And maybe there was the 5th person who had a different idea and nothing came together. No matter how much dialogue you have, that's got to be really frustrating when you can't pull a consensus together. So what do you do after, if a meeting like that happened, what do you do after a meeting like that then to come back to the table and say, okay, let's start.
Sure. Well, there's always a lot of separate conversations too. So, and again, I give credit to all the different leaders having these conversations, and so you just go back at it, and it's one of those things that it takes time. It takes time to resolve these things. It is frustrating when you think you have a deal and one of the members walks away at the end, and that's not good for the people of Michigan. We really should have wrapped up this budget before we left for the 3-week hunting break. And we didn't. And that is very, very frustrating. I'm hopeful that when we come back, we are at that table again talking, but every time we do have this little bump, it does concern you, right? That you're able to get back into that room and continue to talk. But we've got to fix this. We absolutely have to fix it. This is why I was elected. I was elected to solve these problems, and when people walk away and stop the dialogue, it is not good for the people of Michigan.
From charter schools to secondary road patrols to rural hospitals, there are some people that are really going to start feeling the pinch on this. I mean, maybe in the first month it wasn't that tough, but now here we are in the second month of a new fiscal year, and by the time you get back the 1st of December, I mean, some of these problems are going to be, no matter what your philosophy is, no matter what your priorities are, your members, Republican members, are going to be feeling the pressure from constituents out there on some of these cuts.
Sure, absolutely. That's what I really want to encourage is the public, is to go ahead and contact your legislators, contact the governor's office. It's an opportunity. I'm going to look at it this way too. It's an opportunity to reconnect with government as well. A lot of times we pass these budgets and things just go on as they have in the past, and you may not realize all the things that government supports at a state level. But now, when you see when it's not there, just how important these services and this funding is, and I think it's important for the people to stand up and to make their voices heard by contacting their legislators, contact the governor, and put that extra pressure on getting back to the table and getting this done. We are, over a month into the fiscal year. We're going to start the holidays, and this is too important not to address.
Well, you have, as a technical matter, 9 days. 9 session days. Now, I realize that work can be done outside of session and is very often, but if you're going to get everybody together and get supplemental bills passed, which is what would have to happen, is that the legislature, and those bills have already been introduced, the legislature would have to reapprove that spending and send it to the governor, and that would all have to be done, I assume, with an agreement before it was done. So that doesn't happen overnight. So it's a pretty short time schedule to get it done. It
is, but listen, we were all teed up and ready to go. It is ready to go. There is no reason why in a day or two we can't get this done. It's the will to get it done. It's to focus on the budget and not some of this other noise that's going on with the admin board or trying to say, I've got more control over you than, it's getting the budget done. It's getting these services back to where they need to be, funded to where they need to be, and making sure that we are delivering as we are supposed to as a state.
We will continue with our conversation with Leader Greig next. To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. Representative Christine Greig is the leader of the Democrats in the State House. And while the budget conversation has been dominating much of the coverage emanating from Lansing, there are other items out there that she and her colleagues would like to address. We talk about that as our conversation continues. You come back in January. You are still the leader of the Democrats in the House. What is it you want to do in this coming year? Obviously, you got another budget you've got to start putting together.
Turn right back around and do the budget.
Right.
Yeah, we need to get back to the basics, and that is what do families care about, right? They want to make sure that they're healthy. So what are we doing to control the cost of prescription drugs? What are we doing to make sure that the water is clean? We have a huge issue in this state, whether it's PFAS, whether it's lead poisoning. We have got to make sure that no one is afraid to turn on the tap water. Education. We know of study after study that we are underinvesting in education, and it's showing in our national rankings as well. So let's put together some really proactive policies to make sure that we're putting the resources where they're most needed, and that goes into the budget cycle again in 2020. And then of course we want to make sure that our workforce is prepared. If you're going into an apprenticeship or skilled trade, there's a lot we can do to help support those programs. But if you're going on to college, we have got huge huge student debt, and we have a lot of work to do on that too, whether it's helping to refinance a high interest loan, whether it's to reduce the cost of education. There's so many things that House Democrats are ready to roll up our sleeves and work on.
One of the things we talked before we started this interview about our families, and one of the things that I come at with a very personal question is the cost of higher education, because as I look at that. Now, I understand and appreciate that there are programs that could help, and I understand that there are a lot of skilled trades jobs and those kind of things, but on a day-to-day basis, when folks are trying to make house payments, car payments, insurance payments, which are still pretty high, trying to save and provide for a college education is a real burden for a lot of folks. And you talk about college debt, but it's also about the decisions about what kids do going forward. Do they go to college, or do they try to avoid the debt and do something else? As a state, because we have an investment in state universities, do we have any ability to do anything about the cost of education? Because over the course of the years, I've seen administrations say, don't raise tuition more than X amount or you won't get your funding from us. But does that really matter?
Well, there's a lot we can do to maintain the cost of college. So back in, I think it was 2010, there was a huge 15% cut in the funding for higher education. So your budget, again, is a statement of your values, and we can invest more in higher education to bring down the cost. But we can also make sure that taking a loan is affordable as well. We can also do scholarship programs, or look at that as well. When I was growing up, again, it wasn't in Michigan, it was in Indiana, but I'm one of 12 kids. My parents could not afford to send us to college, but because I had a great public education system and I did really well, I was, did pretty good. I had low interest student loans. I had Pell Grants from the federal government. I had help from the university that I went to, and I ended up paying about 1 out of my 4 years in the tuition. The rest I had assistance to doing it. That dream is being lost on our kids in this generation, and we've got to figure out all those different avenues to make it more affordable. We need more kids going to college, and we also need more kids in the skill trade. The whole idea is we need talent, and there's a lot of different ways to develop talent, and we just want to make sure that the options are there for our kids. And I think one thing that we can do at the K-12 level is unlock the opportunity for our students at a much earlier age. Girls decide in middle school whether they like math or not, to tell you the truth. And so we need them to be exposed more to opportunities. If you want to get into the skilled trades, you need to be exposed to what those jobs are at a very early age. And there's a lot more just programmatically that we can do as well too. So when you do decide to go through an apprenticeship program, or you go on to community college, or you go on to higher ed, you know the options, you're more comfortable in the path that you are taking, and that will always make a better financial decision for you.
One of the things that happened 100 years ago when I was in school is we had skilled trades training right in our high schools. What I see today is that many community colleges are stepping up and providing those kind of training classes, even for high school students or for kids who have just graduated and gone into that. Is the state doing enough, or maybe enough is never enough, but is the state doing what it can to help foster those experiences?
I think we're doing better, but we also have to remember that we've had amazing apprenticeship programs out there from organized labor too, and they're stepping up and doing more with community colleges as well. So part of it is even just educating the public on what's already available out there, whether it's in the schools or it's right out of high school. But it's that whole partnership model that we can do a lot better at. And again, I think the more that you have exposure at the K-12 levels and do the apprenticeships in high school and then right out of high school too, then you are going to have these great opportunities for our kids.
We've got a couple of minutes left, and I have to ask you this, because when we first talked and you talked about your lifetime of experiences and the things that you had done and how you arrived at this position, and you talked how you were prepared to do this, and I've watched you over this past year. You have sometimes partnered with Republicans to make things happen that I didn't think would happen. The education budget would be one example of that. And you have also taken a stand that would oppose the folks across the other aisle because you had a different priority. How has your experience over the past year, past 10 months, differed from what you thought it would be as a leader in the State House?
How has it differed? Well, I think, helping legislators being the best legislators that they can be. We have 25 new members out of 52 as well. So I'd say that is a huge priority of mine too. And it might not be something that you see on the outside from day to day, but making sure that we have the best technologies and support for those members, that's been a little different. In terms of working on policies and priorities, I came into this wanting to solve problems. And you have to look at the path that leads to that success at every different point. So sometimes that path, when we talk about the K-12 budget, was working across the aisle, making sure we got an additional $30 million invested in special education, making sure we took out some obstacles in schools that were in partnership models. That was working with my Republican colleagues and working with the Speaker of the House. Then when you're working on opposing, legislation that is burdensome on the everyday person, we have different philosophies on that, and we fight for our values. But at the end of the day, it's about putting the people of Michigan in the middle of that policy and what you feel as a party, as a caucus, the best path to get to that. And you have to be willing to work with your Republican colleagues or going against them and speaking to your values. And so I don't think that's changed, because I've always had the mindset that we're here to solve problems. That's why we were elected. But the path sometimes was a little different than I thought of when it was that I was working across the aisle and the other times where you're standing up and fighting for your values.
So my final question, and I am not putting you on the spot, I'm only asking for a guess, not a prediction. There are two major issues that remain, there are a bunch, but there are two major issues that remain undone right now. Some type of recalculation of the budget that was implemented back in September, and something that looks like infrastructure remodeling in the state. We know what the governor introduced. Not speaking for you, don't believe that's going to happen. So it would have to look different than a 45-cent per gallon gas tax. Are those things doable? First, with restructuring this budget and in the short term, because that was something that probably would have to be done when you go back in December. And then I'm guessing it would take until next year to do something about infrastructure. Can one or both of those things be done?
So I think when we get back from this hunting break at the very beginning of December, our highest priority has to be on restructuring that budget. We talked already about there are critical services that will be losing funding. And so I think we'll come back with that goal in mind, and hopefully now we'll have all of us at the table ready to solve that problem. I am very hopeful that that will get done before the holiday break in December. When we talk about long-term infrastructure funding, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of disagreements on how to generate additional revenue. I can tell you one thing though, that taking revenue from our teachers' pension fund is really not on the table and never should be. And so we have to have these honest conversations about new revenue for this state. And until you're willing to come to the table and really talk about that and look at study after study that says we're underfunding things, it's difficult to find that solution. So that one's going to be a little tougher. But I'm very hopeful on the budget when we get back in December.
We'll be back with a final note next. To the point. So it's going to be quiet in Lansing for a while, but the first part of December, the push will be on, presumably to try to get a budget done, or at least redone. Can that happen in divided government? Well, recently, the Michigan Catastrophic Claims Association said that the assessment for that portion of your auto insurance would be reduced by $120 or 55% next year. The reason, at least in part, the group said, because of the auto NoFault reform passed by the legislature and signed by the governor earlier this year. So it shows, at least in some measure, divided government can work. But will it? We'll find out. That's all for this morning. We'll see you next week, right here, 10 o'clock, for To the Point.